I want to bring back in Nikole Killion. She is on Capitol Hill. She was just asking questions of the Democratic leader of the House, Hakeem Jeffries. We heard you asking about that conversation that he had with President Biden. Talk to our viewers a little bit about what the Democratic leader had to say.
Well, he continued to insist that it was a private conversation and reiterated that he did express the views of his caucus that, they were wide in breadth and scope. But that being said, he would not get into particulars or confirm if he explicitly told the president or asked the president to get out of the race, or if he conveyed the sense that the president could potentially hurt Democrats' chances of taking back the House. I also asked what his response was specifically to some Republican congressional members, and even Ron Klain, who is a very close advisor of the president, who suggested that elected officials pushed the president out. That is something two congressional Republicans have said in some of their releases, saying that they feel that Democratic Party leaders have kind of had too much of a hand in this. But he didn't directly respond to that criticism, only specifically kind of addressing some of the criticism from Republicans, suggesting that, they have issues with their own candidate and their agenda in terms of the former president and what he continues to describe as a MAGA extreme agenda. So that being said, the leader did make a little bit of news in that he did acknowledge that both he and Leader Chuck Schumer are expected to meet with Vice President Kamala Harris at some point today. They're still working out scheduling, but obviously neither leader at this point in time has officially endorsed Kamala Harris. And so when he was asked about that, he said that he will be meeting with the vice president later today.
Yes, and it almost felt like a tease, like there was going to potentially be an endorsement after that. And it goes to the point that you were making, Nikole, about the criticism about Democratic Party leaders making decisions about this election. And that's something that we haven't seen, especially the boldest face names in the Democratic Party, like Obama, Schumer, or Jeffries, give their endorsement yet. But we just got an endorsement from the biggest name so far, which is House Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. How much weight does her endorsement carry?
Well, certainly it carries a lot of weight, obviously, being the Speaker Emerita, and certainly with the California ties, of course, both being members of the California delegation, particularly the Vice President, of course, when she was a member of the Senate. But obviously, Speaker Emerita Pelosi is pretty much viewed as the dean of the the California delegation, if you will. So there is certainly that connection and that relationship that they have had from both serving in the state. And look, the speaker was also very complimentary, not only of the vice president, but certainly of President Biden in her statement yesterday as well, praising him for making a patriotic choice. So that is certainly someone you would like to have in your column as you try to lock up the Democratic nomination. But obviously, again, the vice president still trying to shore up that support with this forthcoming meeting, of course, with both Leader Jeffries and Schumer, in addition to the many calls that she was making yesterday to congressional members.
And it does appear that the vice president is well on her way to shoring up that support, Nikole. So the bigger question in some ways becomes who might be endorsed as a potential running mate from Harris. Are you hearing anything on Capitol Hill about that question?
Obviously we have lawmakers who are just kind of returning back, and there's a lot of focus right now, certainly not only on this, but obviously other matters such as the Secret Service director being on Capitol Hill. But look, I think people are willing to let this process play out in due course. Of course, we have heard names like Pennsylvania Governor Shapiro, Kentucky's Governor Beshear, Maryland Governor's Wes Moore, who just endorsed the vice president today, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, who also endorsed the vice president. So, there are a lot of names floating out there. Obviously, this process is still developing by the minute. So I think it's baby steps that need to be taken in the near term, although certainly time is of essence in terms of the vice president, should she become the nominee, needing to select a running mate as Democrats prepare for their upcoming convention next month.
And you are absolutely right, Nikole. We are taking it minute by minute. Appreciate you bringing us the very latest in this minute.
You bet.